talked about the second of the great Gregories who dominate 14th century Byzantine theology, Saint Gregory Palamas. I may give as subtitle of my talk, Hesychasm Vindicated. Last time I was speaking about St. Gregory of Sinai, and I said that in his day the hesychast tradition of inner prayer was not a subject of controversy. It was generally accepted. But during the last years of Gregory of Sinai, during the time in particular while he was withdrawn in the mountains of Paroria on the Bulgarian border, the whole tradition of inner prayer, going back to Gregory of Nyssa, Evagrius, Macarius, Diadocus of Photiki, the tradition of the Jesus prayer, came under attack. And it is the second Gregory, Gregory Palamas, who emerges as the defender of this tradition of prayer. He is the theologian of hesychasm. Let's first have a look at his life, which falls into four periods. The first period lasts from his birth, which was around 1296, until the year 1317 or thereabouts, when he went to be a monk on Mount Athos. The years of his childhood and youth. Gregory was born in Constantinople. He came from a family with distinguished connections, closely linked with the imperial house. His father was a friend of the Emperor Andronicus II and was tutor to the future Emperor Andronicus III. There is an agreeable story told about his father. One day the emperor was presiding in the Senate. Gregory's father was present. The emperor turned and asked him a question, but Gregory's father did not reply. It is a little unusual when addressed by the emperor to ignore him. And the emperor was just about to repeat his question in a louder voice, when he noted that Gregory's father was practicing mental prayer. In other words, he was saying the Jesus prayer. And so the emperor, not wishing to interrupt his prayer, turned to someone else and raised a different question. I find this an illuminating shaft of light on the situation in the late Byzantine Empire. It was indeed a Christian empire. I would like to think that the same spirit prevails in the British Houses of Parliament, but I'm not so sure. At any rate, Gregory grew up in a family deeply committed to the practice of the Orthodox faith. His father was tonsured a monk on his deathbed, and after his father's death, aged about 16, Gregory gives up a promising secular career and decides to become a monk. His mother, his two sisters, and many of their servants enter convents in Thessaloniki, and Gregory himself with two brothers, goes to Mount Athos. That brings us to the second stage of his life, the years of monastic seclusion, from around 1317 up until 1338. Most of these 20 years were spent on Athos, though for a time, because of the insecurity, because of the inroads of pirates, Gregory withdrew to a hermitage on the mainland near Velia. This was a time when the Byzantine Empire was growing increasingly weak and could no longer defend itself against the advance of the Turks. Gregory spent some of his time in large monasteries on the Holy Mountain, but on the whole he passed his years in the more remote hermitages there. And during his own time on Mount Athos, Gregory of Sinai had likewise lived not in the main Cenobitic monasteries, but in the smaller settlements, which gave a greater opportunity for silence. Gregory Palamas, during his 20 years of seclusion, would certainly have been initiated into the practice of the Jesus prayer. During much of this time he followed a 5-day program, if we may put it so. He would live in a settlement with a few other brothers, but for 5 days he would have spent his time in solitude, not meeting anyone, not speaking with anyone, praying on his own. Then on Saturday and Sunday he would have joined his brethren for the Eucharist and the Divine Office. Then we come to an unexpected change in Gregory's life. The tradition of inner prayer, of hesychasm, into which he'd been initiated on Mount Athos, came under attack from a learned Greek, Balaam, or Varlam. You can either begin the name with a B, or you can pronounce it as V. I shall call him Balaam. Balaam the Calabrian. He came from South Italy, but he was not Latin in background. He does not seem to have studied in Western universities. He was Greek in culture. And Varlam, or Balaam, had come around 1330 to Constantinople because he regarded the Byzantine Empire as the center of the true faith. He was more a philosopher than a theologian, a philosopher in the Neoplatonist tradition. And he launched a comprehensive attack on hesychasm. Gregory felt called to answer Balaam, the Calabrian. He felt called to act as the spokesman for the monks of the Holy Mountain. And so we enter the third period of Gregory's life, the years of controversy, from around 1338 until 1347. Gregory, during much of this time, left the Holy Mountain, came to Constantinople. For some of the time, Gregory was definitely out of favor, even spent some months in prison. But his teaching on hesychasm was vindicated. First of all, at a council in 1341, Balaam was condemned. He went back in a bad temper to South Italy, and in the Latin West gave a very negative picture of Gregory's theology. Balaam spent his later years trying to teach Greek to Petrarch, but without notable success. Then again, the hesychast tradition, which Gregory Palamas represented, was upheld at a second council, 1347, and then indeed by a third council in 1351. These councils held at Constantinople are only local councils, but because they have been accepted by the Orthodox world as a whole, they've come to acquire an ecumenical significance. They are second in importance only to the 7 ecumenical councils of the early Christian centuries. Finally, there is the last period of Gregory's life, from 1347 to 1359. After the years of controversy, we have the years of administration. Gregory was appointed Archbishop of Thessalonica in 1347, though he was not able to take up his post in the city until 1350 because of various disturbances. He proved to be a successful pastoral bishop with a burning zeal for the poor and the oppressed. So he is an example, if you like, of a mystic who returns to society, and in spite of, or rather because of, his years of mystical seclusion, Gregory was able to prove a true shepherd to his flock. He died in 1359. He was glorified as a saint only 9 years later in 1368. And as well as being celebrated on the day of his death in November, he also has a special commemoration on the second Sunday in Lent. First Sunday in Lent is the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and then we have the second Sunday, the Sunday of St. Gregory Palamas, who is seen as continuing the triumph of Orthodoxy. The first Sunday we remember the triumph of Orthodoxy, the definitive restoration of the holy icons to the Church, and then we honor St. Gregory Palamas as continuing this true tradition of Orthodoxy in his own day. So he is prominent and well known in the Christian East. Now, what was the nature of the attack of Balaam on the hesychast tradition? Initially, Balaam and Palamas came into conflict over the question of the filioque. But very soon the subject of dispute between them moved to questions of mystical theology. Balaam basically had 3 points in his attack on Gregory. First of all, Balaam was an apophatic theologian, emphasizing very strongly the unknowability of God. He argued that the deity is beyond our understanding, and so in this life our knowledge of God can only be indirect, through scripture, through church tradition, through the sacraments, yes, through signs and symbols. What Balaam denies is the hesychast claim that it is possible in this present life to have direct experience of God, to have an immediate union with Him. For Balaam, such experience was reserved to the age to come. So that's the first point. Balaam, in his eschatology, is futurist. That is to say, he puts such things as union with God, the vision face to face, into the future, not in this present life. Then there comes a second point arising out of the first. You will remember how St. Simeon, the new theologian, among others, was granted a vision of divine light. This experience of divine light was also something very much present in the Athonite tradition of the 14th century. The hesychasts believed that through inner prayer, especially through the practice of the Jesus prayer, they could enter by divine grace into the mystery of the Transfiguration, and they could behold the light of Tabor, the uncreated light of the transfigured Christ during prayer. Balaam denied this. He said, this is all superstition. The light which the monks are beholding in prayer is not the uncreated light of the Godhead. It is simply a physical and created light. Then, again, closely linked with this, there is a third point in Balaam's attack. Balaam heard about the physical method of prayer used in conjunction with the Jesus prayer, of which I spoke last time when talking of St. Gregory of Sinai. Balaam seems to have learnt about this from certain monks who, while doubtless sincere, were not very well educated, and they gave him a crude and confused account of the meaning of these physical exercises. Balaam denounced the physical technique used with Jesus' prayer as being grossly superstitious and materialistic. You will remember that one of the features in the physical method is that the hesychast sits in a crouching position with his head bowed, looking towards the place of the heart. Very occasionally in the text it says looking towards his navel. Usually it says towards the place of the heart. This led Balaam to ridicule the hesychasts as omphalopsychi, navel psychics, people who locate the soul in the navel. Clearly, Varlam's comprehensive attack raises questions of fundamental importance. The first question, is it possible to have direct experience of God in mystical union during the present life, raises, of course, the basic issue: what is our relationship to God? In what way is God revealed to us? And how far can we share in the mysteries of the future age, even during this present life? The second and third questions raise, among other things, the question, what is the role of the body in the spiritual life? Is it possible to behold the divine light of Tabor through the bodily eyes, even though it is not a physical but a spiritual light? And can the body participate in the task of prayer, for example, through the physical exercises, which Gregory of Sinai, among others, had recommended? How then does Gregory answer Varlam? On the first point, Gregory agrees with Varlam that God is unknowable. In common with Varlam, Gregory stands firmly in the tradition of apophatic theology. He stresses what may be called the ontological gap between God and humankind, between the Creator and the creation. Here is a typical statement from St. Gregory Palamas. If God is nature, then all else is not nature. And likewise, if that which is not God is being, then he is not being. No single thing of all that is created has or ever will have even the slightest communion with the supreme nature, or a nearness to it. Here we have an uncompromising statement of divine transcendence and unknowability. God is not being. That is to say, he is not one object among many existent things. If we say God exists, the word exist bears in his case a sense radically different from that which it possesses when applied to things created. So, developing this line of thought, Gregory speaks of the Godhead as beyond being, beyond essence, hyperousios. This kind of language goes back to the writer known as Dionysius the Areopagite, from around 500, and indeed it goes back before him to other such writers. So Gregory speaks of God as the beyond essence, nameless and surpassing all names. This radically apophatic language can be found also in the West, for example, in the person who was partly contemporary with Gregory Palamas, Meister Eckhart. Thus far, Palamas and Varlam agree God is unknowable. But while Varlam stops at the unknowability, Palamas goes a stage further. God, he says, unknowable and transcendent in his essence or inner being, is knowable and immanent by virtue of his energies. God is essentially unknowable, but existentially revealed through the free acts of his omnipotence. So human beings can attain direct knowledge of God, meeting him face to face. But this is a union with God's energies, not with his essence. So what Gregory is trying to do when he distinguishes in this way between essence and energies is to underline the mystical paradox of which I've spoken many times. He wants to uphold both the otherness and the nearness of God, both the divine transcendence and the divine immanence. Now, this distinction between essence and energies is not by any means an invention of Gregory Palamas in the 14th century. It has a long history. It goes back, for example, to the 4th century. Athanasius, in his work on the Incarnation, says, God is outside all things according to his essence, and within all things through his acts of power. There, Athanasius doesn't use the word energia, energy, but he uses an equivalent term, dynamis, act of power. Basil the Great, in a famous statement in letter 234, says, we know our God from his energies, but we do not claim that we can draw near to his essence. For his energies come down to us, but his essence remains unknowable. So, in our relationship with God, there is always a polarity, a life-giving tension between mystery and revelation. As Gregory puts it, those who are worthy enjoy union with God, the cause of all. He remains wholly within himself, yet dwells wholly within us, and makes us share not in his own nature, but in his own glory and brightness. Nature, of course, means the essence of God. God as transcendent, God as beyond understanding. Here, however, Gregory, instead of using the word energies, uses terms which are perhaps a little more accessible: glory, brightness. The energies of God could also be called grace. So then, there is a polarity. As Gregory puts it, if the saints possess knowledge of God, they possess it in an incomprehensible fashion. Now, in all this, Gregory is seeking to distinguish three levels of union with God. First, there might be a union according to essence. And such a union exists only between the three persons of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They are one in essence. But, says Gregory, the mystical union with God cannot mean that we share the same essence with God. Yes, the Greek fathers talk about theosis, deification, meaning that there is in salvation a real participation in the divine life. But we do not actually become God by essence. We are only made God by grace. So, if we were in the mystical union made God by essence, we would become additional members of the Holy Trinity. The mystical union cannot mean that we become God in exactly the same way that the three persons of the Trinity are God. We remain creatures. So the mystical union cannot be a union according to essence. Then there is, secondly, a union according to hypostasis, hypostatic union. But such a union has occurred once and once only, at the incarnation of Christ. At the incarnation, the divine and the human are united in such a way that in Christ they constitute a single person. More exactly, at the incarnation, the divine person of the Logos takes up human nature into himself in such a way that it is an integral part of his personhood. But the incarnation is unique. In the mystical union, yes, we are united with God, but we do not become exactly what Christ was. In the meeting between the human subject and God in prayer, the human subject does not forfeit its distinctive personal identity. So, the mystical union is not a hypostatic union in the sense of being a merging into one single person. The mystical union is a meeting between persons, person to person. And however close the human person comes in a union of love with God, she or he does not cease to be a human person. We are united with God, we are not absorbed into him or annihilated. As the Macarian homilies put it, Peter remains Peter, Paul remains Paul, and Philip remains Philip. Each continues in his own nature and person, although filled with the Spirit. The mystical union, then, is an encounter between persons, human and divine, not a fusion into a single person, not a swallowing up of the human by the divine, but a continuing relationship of I and thou. However close the I draws to the thou, however much a part of the I the thou is felt to be, yet there is still a meeting between persons. So if the mystical union is not a union according to essence or according to hypostasis, what can it be? The third possibility, says Gregory, is that it is a union according to energy. We are united with God's energies, not with his essence. Therefore there is union but not absorption, union but not confusion. We humans retain our personal identity, but we are filled with the life, the energy of God. The human person is divinized or deified without ceasing to be human. We become gods by grace or status, but never God by essence. Now, Gregory's distinction between essence and energies has been much criticized. Barlam said this destroys the simplicity of God. This undermines the divine unity. And this criticism of Gregory has continued up to the present day. It is still urged by certain Latin Roman Catholic theologians who are looking at it strictly from the scholastic tradition. And by the criteria of Thomas Aquinas, Gregory's distinction between essence and energies doesn't make sense. But Gregory's criteria were not those of Latin scholasticism, and every Christian theologian should be judged by his own criteria. And I think we can say that there is a difference between Thomism and Palamism, but they can be seen as two theologies that, if each is judged in its own terms, are compatible. At any rate, today in the Roman Catholic Church there is considerable reverence for Palamas, and especially he is honored as a saint very widely in the Eastern Catholic tradition. When the Greek service books were reprinted in the 1960s and 70s in a 4-volume anthologion, a kind of Eastern breviary, in the second volume the service for St. Gregory Palamas, appointed for the second Sunday in Lent, was included. In earlier editions of the Greek service books by Catholic sources, Palamas had been omitted, but there's been a real change of direction here, and I know many Catholics who love and honor Palamas. Another criticism made against Gregory's distinction between essence and energies has been that it is an innovation. This was particularly urged by another opponent of Gregory in the 1340s, Akindinos. Now, it is true that Gregory applies this distinction with a precision and sharpness of focus that is not to be found in earlier writers. But the distinction itself, as I've indicated, goes back to people like Athanasius and Basil and Gregory of Nazianzus. It has roots in the earlier patristic tradition. Loyalty to tradition does not mean just a theology of repetition. Loyalty to tradition needs to be creative. I would say Gregory is not an arbitrary innovator, but he did understand the patristic tradition in a creative manner. Living tradition. We are taught to be eagles, not to be parrots, still less ostriches. Now, the divine light for Gregory signifies precisely the energies of God. When the hesychasts behold the divine light in the way that Simeon the new theologian did, precisely they are entering into an experience of the eternal and uncreated energies of God. This light is not a created light, not a mere physical light of the senses. It is beheld through the senses, but it is itself a light of the uncreated being of God. Here is a typical passage in Palamas in which he speaks about the divine light. He's talking about the vision that St. Paul saw when he was caught up into the third heaven. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Here is then the Palamite interpretation of Paul's vision. Paul saw a light without limits below or above or to the sides. He saw no limit whatever to the light which appeared to him and shone around him. But it was like a sun, infinitely brighter and larger than the universe. And he himself stood in the midst of it, having become nothing but I, E-Y-E. Now, you notice there, Palamas does not say that Paul saw the form or figure of Christ in the light. And here Palamas continues the tradition that we found in St. Simeon the New Theologian. Simeon hears the voice of Christ when he has a vision of divine light, just as Paul heard a voice on the road to Damascus. But Simeon does not see the face of Christ or any figure. Palamas has a similar approach to the divine light. It is an experience of total luminosity, an experience of union in love, but an experience beyond visual imagery, an experience without form or shape. Now, Gregory says a number of things about the divine light. But if we are to understand rightly his teaching concerning the energies of God and the divine light, we need first of all to bear in mind that the divine energies are not an intermediary between God and human beings. They're not a gift which God bestows, an offshoot or emanation from God, or a kind of inferior divinity. On the contrary, the energies are God himself, God in action. Likewise, the energies are not a part or subdivision of God. They are the whole God in his entirety. God the Trinity is present undivided in each and all the divine energies. We shouldn't link the energies with one particular person of the Trinity. In all God's actions towards creation, the three persons of the Trinity are active together. So all the energies are Trinitarian. The Son does not have an energy distinct from that of the Father, nor the Spirit distinct from that of the Son. So Gregory writes, each power and energy is God himself. And again, God is wholly present in each of his divine energies. That which is made manifest and accessible to the human intellect, and in which the human person participates, says Gregory, is not a part of God. For if that were so, God would suffer division because of us. But he manifests himself, in a sense, and yet does not manifest himself. We grasp him with our mind, and yet do not grasp him. We participate in him, and yet he remains beyond all participation. So when Gregory distinguishes in this way between the essence and the energies of God, he is not dividing God, not destroying the divine unity, but he's trying to describe what is involved in our experience of God, that we know God and yet we never know him exhaustively. God is immanently present within us, and yet he still remains transcendent. In the doctrine of the Trinity, we distinguish between the essence of God and his three hypostases, the three persons. The distinction between God's essence and his three persons does not destroy the divine unity. No more does the distinction between essence and energies destroy the divine unity. Speaking then of the light, which is the form that we experience the energies of God in, Gregory emphasizes that there is one single light. The light that shone from Christ on Mount Tabor at the Transfiguration. The light that shone from him after his resurrection. The light that is seen now by the saints. And the light which will shine from Christ at the second coming. These are all one single light. In this teaching about the divine light, Palamas is very close to Simeon the New Theologian, but earlier one of his key sources is the homilies of Macarius, and we've already quoted from them how the light can take a bodily physical form when communicated to the human person, and yet the light is not itself bodily or physical. So Gregory says of the light that it is an immaterial light, a light not of matter. That's the same as what Simeon says. It is, he says, a spiritual light. But though it is non-material, this light is not merely imaginary or symbolic. It is an existent reality, says Gregory. And in a way, he says, it is both invisible and yet seen. We see it through our bodily eyes, but it is not actually a light of the senses. Our bodily eyes do not behold the divine light through their own inherent power, but they behold the divine light through the power of the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. However, the body is involved in the divine light. The body shares in salvation. More particularly, Gregory says that this light, the divine light that is the uncreated energies of God, can be termed both light and darkness. And here he's drawing on the paradox of dazzling darkness that we've already explored when we talked about Gregory of Nyssa. Even though it is darkness, says Gregory Palamas, yet it is supremely bright. And in that supremely bright darkness, divine things are given to the saints. In the strict sense, he says, it is light, for it is a supremely positive reality, but in virtue of its transcendence, as experienced by us, it can be termed darkness. So we might say the darkness is not in God, it is in us, because this divine light so far surpasses our human faculties. So it is a light of the age to come, Gregory's eschatology is not just futurist, as was that of Balaam. Gregory's eschatology is inaugurated. The fullness is reserved for the age to come, for the life after the general resurrection. But even now, we share already in the future age, the eternal age to come. So, an inaugurated eschatology, the light that the saints behold is indeed the light of the last day. And, as I've just said, the light embraces the body. There is no division in Gregory between body and soul. His anthropology is holistic. We participate in the light as total persons. And here we might come to the third point in Balaam's attack, the physical exercises. Gregory did not think that these physical exercises described by Gregory Sinai and by earlier writers like Nikephoros, he did not think that this was the essence of inner prayer. He didn't see these exercises as constituting the heart of the Jesus prayer. He said, yes, they're useful, suitable for beginners. Today we say rather differently, don't use them unless you've got an experienced spiritual guide. But, said Gregory, even if these exercises are not essential, yet they do express a true view of the human person. They do underline that the human person is a unity of body and soul, and that the body is to play a part in the work of prayer. Balaam's view of human personhood is basically Neoplatonist. The human being is a soul in a body, and no real role is assigned to the body in the life of prayer and the vision of God. Palamas's doctrine of human personhood is basically scriptural. Man is a single whole, a unity of body and soul together. Christ at his incarnation, says Gregory, took a human body as well as a human soul, and so he has made the flesh an inexhaustible source of sanctification. In the Eucharist, Gregory adds, we do not just feed on Christ with our souls, but we receive his body and blood. In communion, we receive Christ physically. The body, he says, is deified along with the soul. There he's quoting St. Maximus the Confessor. The flesh also is transformed. It is raised on high together with the soul, and together with the soul it enjoys communion with God, becoming itself the domain and dwelling place of God. So, the body shares in the experience of theosis. And Gregory allows for the fact that sometimes the bodies of the saints are transformed by divine light, as happened notably in the 19th century in the life of St. Seraphim of Sarov. He who has received the divine energy, says Gregory, becomes holy as light. A bodily transfiguration. If in the age to come, says Gregory, the body will share with the soul in ineffable blessings, it must certainly share in them so far as possible, even now. So there we have Gregory's vindication of hesychasm. God is unknowable, but revealed through the divine energies. Human beings can participate in those energies, not only in the age to come, after the resurrection, but here and now. The saints see these energies as light. The human person is a single unity of soul and body. So the body shares in the work of prayer and in the vision of God. The saints behold the light through their bodily eyes, and they themselves shine with the light that they behold. No division between soul and body, between the spiritual and the material. The divine energies permeate our human bodies. They permeate the whole visible creation. If I had more time, I could develop that point, that Gregory Palamas is very much an ecological saint, a saint for our own day, when we are conscious of the need to defend the spiritual potentialities of the material creation. In this, as in many other ways, St. Gregory is definitely a saint for our time. Thank you.
Yeah.